It all started with a sneeze. Somewhere far from Europe, most likely the Black Death began in Central Asia, around the arid steppes where rats and fleas had been minding their own business until trade routes opened up like deadly highways. These weren't your average have-a-nice-day roads, no, these were silk roads, caravans clinking with exotic spices, silks, and infected fleas. By 1346, the Mongol armies, who didn't believe in personal space or hand sanitizer, laid siege to a Genoese trading post at Kaffa, modern-day Crimea. As their soldiers began dropping like medieval flies, the Mongols did what any sensible person would do. They catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the city walls. Biological warfare, 14th century style. The Genoese traders, being smart businessmen but bad biologists, fled by ship to Italy. They brought with them the greatest trade item Europe never asked for, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. Thus, the stage was set. Rats came aboard. Fleas bit humans and people died, a lot. Our story begins in the heart of Asia, specifically in or around these parts, though nobody knows for sure because, well, nobody was keeping track. What we do know is that the plague arrived there via merchants traveling along the Silk Road. These trade routes had been bustling with activity for centuries, linking the East and the West in a tangled web of commerce. But now they were about to be infamous for something much less marketable, disease transmission. Fast forward to 1346, the Mongol Empire, those guys again, was at its merciless best, conquering everything in sight. Their army laid siege to the Italian trading post of Kaffa. Today the city is known as Feodosia, but back then it was a crucial stop for merchants. The Mongols, who really should have stayed in history class instead of going on all these military escapades, decided to wage war against the Genoese. Instead of investing in, say, indoor plumbing, they hurled plague-ridden corpses over the city walls, infecting anyone who got too close. A little special treat for the citizens of Kaffa. Now, you might think this is pretty messed up, and you wouldn't be wrong, but this is just a preview of what's to come. The beleaguered Genoese traders, not ones to let a little thing like a global pandemic stand in the way of their business, fled to Italy by ship. They probably thought they had it made because, ships are a great way to avoid catching diseases, right? Wrong. They were basically hitching a ride with the Grim Reaper. And here's where our story takes a turn for the worse. Those pesky fleas, yada bacteria, remember them? Well, they were stowing away on those very same ships. So when the Genoese fleet arrived in Sicily, they brought with them an unwelcome guest, Yersinia pestis, aka the Black Death. These bacteria usually hang out in rodents like rats, which can carry them without getting sick themselves. But when rat populations explode, like they often do in crowded cities, the fleas get a little desperate. They start looking for new hosts, and that's when things get really bad. When those fleas crawl onto humans, they inject a little bacteria into us with each bite. And unlike the common folk, the rich had a particular fondness for cats. I mean, who doesn't love a good cat nap? However, in the 14th century, cats were also considered a sign of wealth and luxury. So, if you were rich, you could afford to buy nice things like gloves so you didn't have to use your hands to open boxes. You see, back in the day, fancy folks were big on gloves. And guess what? Gloves are great for spreading plague. If you happen to pick up a pair of used gloves from, say, a plague victim, you're essentially holding on to a nice little plague party. All you need is a few rat fleas looking for a new home, and voila, you're the new host. So the plague started hopping from rats to humans, and before you could say bubonic plague, Europe was in trouble. And that, my friends, is how the Black Death turned Europe upside down. Join us next time as we dig into what life was like during the plague, because even if you survived the plague, life was still pretty rough. And if you want to learn more about fascinating historical tales like this one, stay tuned for more updates. Thanks for watching. The plague. That time when Europe's population dropped by 30 to 50%, a real bummer. And like all the worst pop stars, it just kept coming back for more. For 5 centuries, bubonic plague, aka the Black Death, was the worst party crasher in human history. And it hit Europe like an unwanted pop star on tour. First stop, Sicily, 1347. That spring, ships arrived from the east, full of corpses, dying sailors, and rats that weren't paying rent. The Sicilians took one look and said, "No thanks," but it was too late. The fleas had already jumped ship, literally. Within 3 months, the Black Death was sweeping through mainland Italy, then France, then Spain, England, and beyond. Imagine you're a townsperson in the 14th century. You step outside and see your neighbor drop dead in the street. Blood is coming out of his mouth and nose. Maybe he has the sweating sickness, or God forbid, the Red Death. You watch him turn a ghastly green and wish you hadn't eaten that big breakfast of bread, cheese, and wine. But whatever it is, it's not good. Over the next few weeks, you start feeling kind of feverish yourself. And there's those swollen buboes or lymph nodes. Nice, you'll probably die soon. So you flee the city, hoping to outrun your fate? No need to panic, right? Just walk away from the nearest volcano, infected person, and/or pile of rat droppings, right? Wrong. As you trudge along, you hear a commotion up ahead. A group of townspeople have caught a couple of fellow escapees spreading rumors about how the plague came from divine punishment for humanity's sins. They're whipping them in the streets, a small price to pay for not dying, you think. But maybe there's something to those rumors. Maybe this is God's way of punishing you for wearing that really tight belt that your mother warned you about. You make it to a new town, but it doesn't take long for people there to start dropping too. Soon the whole place is in chaos. People are running around in circles, flailing their arms and screaming, "Stop the music." Okay, bad example. They were probably screaming something else. But the point is, even if you didn't have the plague, watching everybody else die was probably pretty traumatizing. Many survivors reacted the only ways they knew how. Some fled cities for the countryside, only to find that the fresh air and open spaces did nothing to stop the plague. Others flogged themselves in the streets, hoping God would notice their bruised backs and spare them. Still, others blamed foreigners, beggars, and anyone who wasn't dying fast enough. By the end, people were blaming people. Basically anyone who wasn't part of their immediate family and wasn't dead yet. Because when faced with an invisible, unstoppable killer, the best thing to do is blame someone who isn't doing anything to help. Classic 14th century behavior. But in reality, the plague was brought to Europe by rats carrying fleas infected with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The bacteria probably came from rodents in Asia, where the disease is found naturally, but nobody knew any of that. And while they were busy blaming each other, the plague merrily hopped from host to host. Some victims suffered from bubonic plague, which caused painful swellings or buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck. Others developed pneumonic plague, which infected their lungs and made breathing difficult. Imagine trying to breathe when every breath feels like walking through a cactus field. Ouch! Still others got septicemic plague, which meant the bacteria had entered their bloodstream. They could die within a few days and often did. Even if you weren't a walking pneumonia diagnosis, life during the plague was still a drag. Entire communities could be wiped out in weeks. Food started to spoil faster. Trade routes shut down. Survivors had to deal with shortages of everything from food to doctors. If the plague didn't kill you, the treatments might have. Doctors donned the finest attire to ward off infection, a wax canvas coat, mask and gloves. Lovely. They also carried a staff with a sponge on the end to wipe the sweat off their patients' brows. Great. What could go wrong? Oh, everything. The heavy clothes made them sweat buckets. The masks smelled like dirty socks. And all that scrubbing meant they were constantly dipping their hands into their patients' wounds. No wonder so many doctors died. This is a plague of mistakes. In fact, it wasn't until the 1800s that scientists identified the actual cause of the plague. Yersinia pestis, carried by rats, spread by fleas. Bubonic plague still exists today, but it's much rarer. Thanks to modern medicine, most cases occur in rural areas of Africa, Asia, and South America. If you do get it, antibiotics can save your life. And unlike in the Middle Ages, we now know not to blame foreigners, beggars, and people wearing tight belts. I hope. On the worst day of your life, right as you're about to get medieval plague, also known as the Black Death, here's what you could expect. First, a fever. You may be surprised that this is where it started, not with the boils, but with a fever. The victim would start off feeling very ill with a high temperature and chills. Next, their lymph nodes would begin to swell up under their arms, on their necks, and in their groins. These painful, tender, round lumps are called buboes, and they would grow larger and larger until they resembled overfilled water balloons, and they wouldn't just be any color. Oh no, these buboes would turn black, like something a demon sneezed out. Then they'd start to feel very ill again, and this time the vomiting would begin. Medieval doctors didn't know what caused the plague, but they had plenty of theories, none of which were correct. They believed that disease came from bad smells or miasma, and that the best way to avoid getting sick was to avoid bad air. So, if you're currently watching this video while sitting next to someone who has the plague, you might want to switch seats because that person needs to avoid bad air. What? You don't have any other seats left? Well, then you should probably put some onions near the sick person. That's right. Crushed emeralds were another popular treatment, as was sitting near a fire. Unfortunately, none of these treatments worked. But let's say you avoided all the bad air, you sat as far away from the sick person as possible, and you even put crushed emeralds on your buboes. What then? Then you would still die. Most people who contracted the plague died within 3 to 5 days. Now, in medieval medicine, that was considered fast-acting. Back then, the usual course of treatment for most illnesses was to wait for the illness to run its course. So, 3 to 5 days was speedy, I guess. Sometimes, though, the plague would kill you even faster than that. Some people dropped dead in the middle of conversation, others mid-step or mid-prayer. Just imagine you re-saying your daily Hail Marys when suddenly you feel a fever coming on and your lymph nodes begin to swell up. You try to make it back home, but you can't. You collapse in the street and die, not exactly ideal. For those unfortunate enough to have pneumonic plague, the infection would spread to their lungs. This meant that in addition to all the other symptoms, they would also have to deal with coughing and bleeding. The coughing would start off mild at first, maybe even producing blood-tinged mucus. Then it would intensify until the victim was racked with violent coughs that sounded like a demon choking on its own shadow. The bleeding would begin in the lungs as well, causing the victim to cough up blood-filled phlegm. Eventually, the coughing fits would become so intense that the victim would bleed from their mouth, nose, and eyes. Their entire body would become a human chimney spewing forth plague smoke. And this was almost certainly a death sentence. The pneumonic plague had a mortality rate of around 90 to 100%. So once again, no matter how many onions you crushed, how many emeralds you rubbed on your skin, or how much fresh air you got, you would eventually die. The best thing you could hope for was a quick death, meaning one that took less than a week. But really, the only thing you should have hoped for was to be born in a different time and place. It's hard to imagine how the people of the Middle Ages dealt with the plague, but you can learn more about it by checking out the series in the description. Thanks for watching. This is one of those stories that has been sadly ingrained in my memory. Imagine a world where no one wants to go to work, churches are empty, and all your neighbors are either dead or hiding. That was Europe during the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague. Entire villages were wiped out. Fields went unplowed, shops closed. Graves were dug en masse. If this sounds familiar, yes, history has a way of repeating itself, just with less plague and more Wi-Fi. When I first read about the Black Death, I was struck by how modern it felt. People were dying, governments were failing, and the economy was tanking. We've seen similar scenes in our own time, haven't we? But there were also things that were very different, stranger even. Like, have you ever heard of a dancing plague? Yeah, me neither. The year is 1346 and the Black Death is sweeping across Europe. It's a horrible, horrible thing to witness, this pestilence that kills so easily and takes no prisoners. People are dropping left and right. The death toll is staggering. Entire villages are being wiped out. Cities are becoming ghost towns. The survivors are fleeing to the countryside for safety, but the plague follows them there. What are they to do? Well, some turn to God, they pray for mercy, they attend Mass, they confess their sins, but the churches are becoming emptier. The priests are refusing to administer last rites. Many have fled or died. Those still alive refuse to go anywhere near the sick. They abandon entire communities, leaving them to fend for themselves. That was the situation when Father Cephas visited the village of Emsa. He found only 3 people willing to help bury the dead. Everyone else had fled. So what did they do? They barricaded themselves inside their homes and waited for it to pass, but it didn't pass. It just kept getting worse and worse. Within weeks, 250 corpses had piled up in the streets. Meanwhile, rumors are spreading. People are whispering about who or what is responsible for this plague. Some blame the Jews. They say that they poisoned the wells. Others blame the poor. They say that the stench of their rotting corpses is attracting rats, which then spread the disease. Still, others blame the clergy. They say that God is punishing us for our sins. But these are just rumors. There is no proof that any of this is true. But as the plague continues to spread, the rumors grow louder. And soon they're not just rumors anymore. They become pogroms. Entire Jewish communities are being driven out of their homes. Their shops are being destroyed. Their synagogues are being burned to the ground. And when they try to flee, they're hunted down and murdered. But the violence doesn't stop at the Jews. Anyone who's different becomes a target. Gypsies, beggars, foreigners, anyone who's not like the rest. They're accused of spreading the plague and they're killed. Entire communities are being wiped out, including some of the most vulnerable, the sick, and the dying. In the end, the plague kills 25 million people. It's one of the worst disasters in human history, and yet somehow it's forgotten. No one talks about it anymore. It's as if it never happened, but it did happen. And we need to remember, as artists began to depict scenes from everyday life, they also began to depict the danse macabre, the dance of death. This new genre was born out of the Black Death. It showed skeletons dancing with the living. At first, it was meant to be a warning, a reminder that death was everywhere. But as the plague continued to spread, it became something else entirely. It became a celebration of death. To the artist, it didn't matter who you were or what you had done in life. When you died, you became part of the dance. You joined the skeletons and the dance was eternal. What can we learn from this story? What can we take away from it? Well, I think there are many lessons to be learned here. One is that when times are tough, people look for someone to blame. They need a scapegoat, and they'll find one. It doesn't matter if the scapegoat is innocent. Another lesson is that when people are afraid, they don't always make the best decisions. They abandon reason and logic, and they do whatever they feel most strongly about at the moment. And another lesson is that when things are bad enough, people will do terrible things. They'll burn down entire neighborhoods and kill everyone inside. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Also, please subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you. So, I was rereading some old history books this weekend. Just for fun, nothing like cracking open a 14th century medical textbook for a good time. And I came across something really interesting. You'd think after wiping out a third to half of Europe's population, the Black Death would pack up and leave. But no, the plague was just getting comfortable. It came in waves. The first one, between 1347 and 1351, was the deadliest, but it returned every few years like an ex who refuses to move on. London alone saw repeated plague visits for centuries. One in 1665 killed 100,000 people. Yes, the same London that later dealt with the Great Fire in 1666. Talk about bad timing. Each recurrence brought new desperation. Quarantine became a more accepted idea. Entire homes and ships were marked with symbols and locked for 40 days. Hence, quaranta, the root of the word quarantine. And still the disease clung on as if Europe owed it rent. Rats didn't care, fleas didn't care. The bacteria definitely didn't care. Humanity just kept adapting, grieving, and surviving. I couldn't help but think we're kind of in a similar situation right now. A new disease emerged and swept across the globe. At first it felt overwhelming, unstoppable. And as we struggled to understand it, it kept changing, shifting, becoming more transmissible, more deadly. There were moments when it seemed like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. We hunkered down and did our best to adapt, wearing masks, keeping our distance, clinging to hope. We waited for the wave to pass, hoping it would bring us back to the way things were before. But as the months dragged on and the death toll climbed, we began to realize this disease wasn't going anywhere. We were in it for the long haul. As a historian, I suppose I was always aware that pandemics weren't one-and-done events. They recur, mutate, and return again and again until we find a way to stop them. Still, I think most of us hoped this one would be different. Maybe we thought because science had come so far since the days of the plague, we'd be able to stamp out COVID quickly. Or maybe we just didn't want to believe something so awful could still happen. But here we are, 2 years later, still trying to figure out how to stop this virus from spreading. And I can't help but feeling a strange sense of solidarity with those early modern Europeans. Not that I'm comparing COVID to the Black Death, of course not. But it is interesting to see how people reacted to a seemingly endless barrage of outbreaks. In 1368, Boccaccio wrote, "Men, women and children fell victims to it in such numbers that no one could ever hope or even dream to outlive it." That could have been written yesterday. How many times did London need to experience the plague before it built up immunity? How many more outbreaks will we have before we reach herd immunity? Or will we achieve it at all? History doesn't have all the answers, but it does offer perspective. As a historian, I can tell you the plague eventually ended, but it took centuries. And while a devastating pandemic may not be on the horizon, the threat of another one always lingers. We have to accept that diseases will continue to emerge and find ways to adapt without losing sight of the progress we've made. When faced with the plague, people turn to medicine, to religion, to community, to escape. Some blamed Jews, others blamed God. People created theatrical performances to mock the disease. Some fled to the countryside, while others stayed behind to take care of the sick. People adapted their diets. They wore protective clothing. They developed new technologies to help purify water and air. They established quarantine zones. They developed public health campaigns. We're doing all of those things too. And none of it is easy. But history also shows us that we have the capacity to endure and to adapt. And however distant they may seem, the lessons of the past can help us through the challenges of the present. If you found this video interesting, please consider supporting the channel. Thanks for watching. The Black Death was one of history's worst plagues. It wiped out 30 to 50% of Europe's population. It led to horrible things happening, like people fleeing villages, abandoning their homes and loved ones, or turning on each other, like blaming Jewish communities for the plague or the poor working conditions in factories. Yuck. But oddly enough, once the dying slowed down, something strange happened. Change. The Black Death had an unexpected side effect. It totally changed the social, economic, and even artistic landscape of Europe. Let's dig into that. Okay, first off, let's talk about how the plague affected the economy. With so many people dead, the labor force basically collapsed. Suddenly, there were very few workers to do the jobs that the Black Death didn't wipe out. This led to a real problem, especially for landowners who had fields that needed planting and factories that needed workers. To solve this issue, peasants were in high demand. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and even leave their manors to work somewhere else without the threat of being punished by their lord. That's right. The Black Death made it so that peasants could actually have some power. It led to the 1381 Peasants' Revolt in England, when peasants rose up against the nobility. They wanted to get rid of serfdom, the system that tied them to their land and made them work for their lords. Now, they didn't totally succeed, but they did make some gains. The revolt was a big deal because it showed that feudalism, the medieval system of society, was starting to fall apart. Lords no longer had total control over their subjects, and peasants were not as powerless as they had been before. But wait, there's more. The Black Death also dealt a serious blow to the church. Remember, at the time, the Catholic Church was super powerful. It had a lot of control over people's lives and was super rich too. But when the plague hit, people started to question the church's teachings. Why didn't God heal the sick? Why didn't priests have the power to stop the plague? Why didn't the Pope step in and help? People started to think that maybe the church wasn't as powerful as it claimed to be, which led to what we call the Protestant Reformation about 100 years later. People started leaving the Catholic Church and forming their own. Thinkers like Martin Luther questioned the Church's authority and the way people could earn salvation. And hey, you might have heard of him. And it's not just political and economic changes we're talking about. The Black Death also affected art and literature. Before the plague, art often focused on religious themes and was pretty idealized. After, there was a shift towards more realism and a focus on everyday life. Writers and artists started exploring deeper questions too. What is the meaning of life? What happens after death? How do we deal with suffering? Works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Shakespeare's Hamlet tackled these big questions head-on. So yeah, the Black Death was super deadly and caused a ton of problems. But in the long run, it shook up medieval Europe in a big way. It made people question old systems, beliefs, and ways of life. It helped bring feudalism to an end and started the Reformation. It inspired new art and literature that explored big questions and made people think differently. The Black Death was a turning point in history, a moment when the medieval world ended and the path to the modern era began. Thanks for watching. Bye. Sitting in a room full of flowers, sweet-smelling but deadly. No, this isn't a set for the next season of The Bachelor. It's the best available treatment for the plague. Well, that or throwing flower petals from a tower while screaming, "Beware the pestilence" at passers-by. Though, to be fair, that method has its limits. What if a deadly disease could spread across the globe in mere months, killing millions along the way? Turns out we're living in the best timeline because that is exactly what happened. So let's learn how humanity got here, how it ended, and how it could happen again. Okay, let's start at the beginning, or at least a beginning. Our story starts in the 19th century when humans decided that rats were gross. This is a relatively new development. For most of human history, humans and rats have had a loving, mutually beneficial relationship. Sure, they sometimes bite you and carry diseases, but their dastardly deeds are also what make them such devoted companions. Like, they will steal your food, but they will also eat your homework. See, rats are kind of like toddlers, small, annoying, always getting into stuff. And just like toddlers, they're extremely cute. And also just like toddlers, they can carry diseases that kill millions of people. The plague, or bubonic plague, is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It spreads through fleas, which live on rats, which cough, sneeze, and burp all over the place. Back in the 1800s, cities were like rat pizza towers. There were so many rats, and they were so close together, it was basically a rat buffet. And since there was so much to eat, there was plenty of opportunity for things to get gross. Rats would regurgitate their food, leaving little presents for humans both indoors and outdoors. But wait, this is a story about a pandemic. Where are the rats flying around the world? Well, enter the Orient Express, or really any ship, train, or wagon heading from Asia to Europe. In the 1800s, trade routes were well established between Asia and Europe, and rats stowed away on every ship, train, and wagon. They weren't doing it on purpose, obviously. They were just trying to get more rat cheese. But when they arrived in a new port city, they brought gifts from the East, or really gifts from the rats in the East. In 1855, the plague arrived in England, and it did not bring Christmas. By 1862, it had reached the U.S. The second wave of the plague started in India, then moved to China and Russia before arriving back in Europe in 1900. It spread quickly, arriving in San Francisco in 1906, and causing a total of 108,000 deaths worldwide. Today, there are still rare cases of the plague in the U.S., China, and other parts of Asia, Africa, and Europe. Most cases are mild and easily treated with antibiotics, though you do need to get those antibiotics pretty fast. If you wait too long, the bacteria can spread through your blood, attack your organs, and make you bleed all over the place. Not exactly a walk in the park, but also not the worst thing you'd see on a busy Saturday night in Prague. Even so, the death toll from the bubonic plague is staggering. In the 14th century alone, it killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people, wiping out 30 to 50% of Europe's population. What makes the plague so terrifying isn't just its death toll, it's also how quickly it spreads. During the Black Death outbreak, Europe saw its first case in Sicily in October of 1347. By the following March, more than half of the people in Sicily were dead. By July of 1348, the plague had arrived in France and England. Within 2 years, more than a quarter of the population of England was dead. So given how quickly the Black Death spread, it's no wonder people were afraid. They couldn't see the bacteria, but they saw the effects of it. They didn't know how it spread, but they knew it was spreading, so they did what anyone would do. They blamed God, of course. And witches, don't forget the witches. Throughout history, people have found lots of things to blame for disease outbreaks, from bad air to broken hearts. But in the Middle Ages, the go-to culprit was God, who was apparently pretty ticked off about something. In 1346, the bishop of the French city of Évreux blamed the Jews, claiming they had poisoned wells to punish Christians. That same year, the citizens of York, England, rounded up the local Jews, forced them to convert to Christianity or burn to death. To watch the whole thing, you can check out the archives of the British Library's YouTube channel. Over the centuries, people have gotten better at figuring out what causes diseases. We figured out that bad air, broken hearts, and Jews aren't to blame. But despite all our scientific progress, we still have plenty to fear. The plague still exists. Diseases don't care about borders, flags, or Twitter followings. What it takes to start a pandemic is one rat, one flea, one ship, or one cough in a crowded room. And sure, the world was a very different place in the Middle Ages, but that doesn't mean we're in the clear. Next time you feel frustrated with modern medicine or vaccines or health guidelines, remember sitting in a room full of flowers may smell nice while you wait to die? It won't actually help.